The broadcast. The roads through Brookfell were thin black ribbons laid over a patchwork of cornfields and gravel pits, and at that hour they belonged to him. Owen Lark knew every slump in the asphalt, every stretch where the ditch crept close and the shoulder fell away, though knowing didn't keep his eyes from aching. He had driven home after late shifts for so long that the route felt like a hallway in a house he no longer questioned. He kept one hand light on the wheel and one hand on the radio knob, the dashboard a dim island in an otherwise blank dark. The warehouse let him out past midnight most nights, though there was no punch clock anymore, only an electronic badge reader that chirped no matter when he swiped. He carried the sound of the place with him, the long drone of compressors, the cough of the forklift, the whisper of freezer curtains pushed aside. Even with the windows up, he could smell cold air and cardboard on his jacket. He drove with the heater on low so the windshield wouldn't T-fog and kept the vents aimed at his hands until they prickled. The radio belonged to the car long before it belonged to him. It had a dial that clicked smooth and a speaker that wasn't kind to music, flattening it to tin. Static lived at the edges. When he grew restless with silence, he would turn the knob a fraction at a time, letting the dial sweep through talk, gospel, farm reports, late oldies, and always a haze of crackle between. There was comfort in the white noise. It felt like wind inside the dash. He was tired in the way that sat behind the eyes. His eyelids felt salted. He blinked and felt the road continue under him. He thought about the unopened pay envelope stuffed in the visor, not because the money mattered in that second, everything was already spoken for, but because the paper made the visor hang heavy, and he could see it sag in the corner of his eye. His mind floated up and away, not unhappy, just slack. He turned the knob again, and the speaker answered with a dry sea of static. He left it there. Sometimes the crackle helped him measure distance. The sound weighed time. He drove past the old sawmill turnoff, then the water tower, then the field where frogs sang in warmer months, and where now, under frost, he imagined them layered like coins in the mud. The road ahead showed itself in the sweep of his headlights, and then vanished. There was no moon. On the ridgeline to the west, red beacons pulsed on the wind turbines, winking in a rhythm that did not match the thudding in his chest. Then a voice walked in through the speaker, as if it had been standing just outside the door. He knew in the first instant that it was his voice. Not the way he heard it in his head, but the way a clerk once played back a recorded statement he had given after a forklift accident years ago. Oddly thinner, oddly more deliberate a grain in it, he didn't recognize as belonging to him until he did. It was his voice with the edges sanded down. "Traveling east on the county road," the voice said in that calm, flat tone, like a man delivering grain yields. "In a pale sedan, with a dent on the rear quarter. He's tired. He has the heater aimed at his hands. He's looking at the visor and thinking about the envelope behind it." Owen squeezed the steering wheel. He could feel the seam of the faux leather press into his palm. He would have changed the station, would have stabbed the knob down past static, past the church service, to anything else. But he didn't move. He didn't even breathe. "The road curves near the gravel pit," the voice continued, his own voice, speaking from the car's mouth, with a careful tempo like it was counting, but refusing to say the numbers. He watches the shape of the field, the wind not moving, the hum of the tires steady as a fluorescent ballast. The comparison struck him. It was the sort of thing he thought sometimes when he was very tired, when the world seemed like it had a glaze on it. He lifted his foot without thinking, and the car eased. The radio was quiet, except for the voice. No hiss behind it, no busy channel crosstalk, just his voice and the engine's low song. He reaches for the dial and hears static, the voice went on, steady, unhurried. He feels that he has driven this hour before in a loop and that he will do it again and again. The shoulder drops away where the ditch deepens. He presses his right hand against air coming from the vent and thinks about the frogs he will not see until spring. Owen adjusted his seat, as if that could change the way it all fit. He glanced in the rear view, only because something in him wanted to prove that the car's cabin looked the way it should. The back seat was a shadow behind him, the road through the rear window a ribbon of black swallowing itself, and somewhere in that darkness the faint wink of a pair of far-off lights. "The truck comes up behind him," the voice said, and Owen's throat tightened. He doesn't know it yet. He will not hear it right away. He will see the glare first. He will choose whether to believe it matters. He became aware of sound he had not noticed, a broad hum rising, not his, not the car's own. He knew that tone, the way a large engine fills the world without hurry. He felt his left foot press down lightly, his right ease off. He watched the rear view, and the road behind him bloomed with two round discs, far, then less far, then pressing nearer, like coins held in a fist. The tires under him sang as they did when the road pitched slightly and the tread began to whine. "Moments divide," the voice said. He thinks about lane lines he cannot quite see. He thinks about the gravel at the edge. He imagines a scrape, as if the car is already scraping. He makes a catalogue of small damage and assigns it to the future. The lights in the mirror grew. He touched the turn signal and felt the click. The voice continued. He wonders if the report will note that he paused. He wonders who writes reports. He wonders if there is a way to climb the ditch. The voice did not change. It did not care that he now gripped the wheel so hard the joints in his fingers ached. The truck fills the mirror and then fills all mirrors. He tries to keep to his own side, to be neat on the lane. He wants to be neat all at once. The glare washes his hands white and makes them no longer his. The truck was there now, not merely an idea, the sound of it flattening everything else. He felt the push of its wind before it was on him. He saw a bank of lights open like an eye, and then he was a small thing ahead of a large thing, and he understood how silt must feel when the river takes a bend and the whole body of it leans against some soft part of shore. He dropped his foot without meaning to. The car surged forward, and the radio spoke in his voice. He chooses to believe the truck will stay straight. He chooses to be sure. He chooses not to panic. He will discover that the trailer drifts a little. He will correct. The body will complain later in its small ways. The truck roared beside him, a bright side, a blank white side, a long wall of rivets and cord, and there was for a breath a tremor, where the trailer seemed to wobble and the wind shoved him toward the ditch. He hauled back and felt rubber protest and then grip and hold. The truck moved past, its brakes whispering. The smell of warm diesel tried to come in around the windows. Then it was gone, only taillights disappearing and the road returning to itself. He let the car slow. He listened. The radio was still quiet, except for the voice. He feels a lurch that isn't in the car, his own voice announced, and he could feel the truth of it. His heart sat high. The voice was patient, almost kindly. He makes a promise to change a thing. He will set the promise on the counter with his keys and the envelope, and it will sit there until morning, and then the day after, and then become part of the counter. He will forget that it had a shape once. The dial under his fingers felt slick. He spun it down to local music and heard a song about leaving or staying. He could not tell which. He turned it to the farm report. The agricultural man spoke of hog futures in a way that sounded like he was asking after a neighbor. It didn't matter. Owen turned the radio off. Silence took the seat the voice had vacated. He drove. At the apartment, a second-floor unit in a low block that smelled faintly of damp carpet and warm dust from neighboring vents. He sat for a while with the engine off, holding the steering wheel in the dark. The sound of the cooling engine ticked. In the building, a television behind a wall laughed and then sighed. He took the envelope from the visor. The paper inside made a little snick as it slid. He held it for a beat and then pushed it back up where it had been. because he could feel that promise the voice had mentioned trying to form, and he did not know what shape to give it. He went up the stairs with his work boots in one hand to keep quiet. The hall's fluorescent light flickered enough to suggest thought. He fitted his key blindly, turned it, stepped in, and closed the door on the stairwell's breadth. His apartment had the particular architecture of someone living alone for a long time. A couch that had learned his angles, a coffee table with the ring marks of grocery store milk jugs, a kitchen that held the hum of the refrigerator, like a distant transformer. He had a towel drying on the oven handle and another thrown over the shower door. He thought about folding them properly, suddenly aware of the way they slumped. He did not. He turned the radio on again. Not the car radio, the small set in the kitchen he kept between the blades of the toaster, and a jar for odd nails, the kind with a plastic face and a telescoping antenna. He had found it at a thrift store for a few bills, battery compartment clean. He wondered now whether it would be different, whether the voice could only haunt the car like a particular smell. He let the kitchen radio hum and then began turning the dial. He found music, then a late traffic report that sounded like a weatherman forced to do somebody else's job. Then a pastor who laughed as he spoke and made laughter part of the sermon, like a joint between two fence posts. He turned to static and felt the small hairs on his arms lift, as if whatever was out there had leaned in. Nothing came under the static but static. He almost felt grateful for the blankness. He left the radio there as if leaving a door ajar might let a cat choose to come in or not. He washed his hands at the sink and watched the water cloud with warehouse dust, the slick grit leaving his fingers. He ate a sandwich standing up. He turned the refrigerator's small dial a notch colder, for no reason, then turned it back, not wanting to think about the voice that would say he had done so. He slept badly. He woke to the skitter of the heater turning itself on. He opened his eyes to the dim shape of the room, and then involuntarily listened for a voice. The apartment said nothing. He listened to his own breathing. He could hear his mouth at rest and disliked the vulnerable sound of it, like a small animal at a cave's mouth. Morning came in pale through the cheap blinds. He made coffee and stood in the doorway while it dripped, the smell working its way through the apartment like a familiar tune. Across the street, the mail carrier walked with a speed that showed how long he had been doing it. Owen poured his coffee and turned on the kitchen radio to the farm report because the man's voice there was the least like his own. He didn't have to go in until later. The warehouse had moved to flexible scheduling in a way that meant employees were allowed to work when the freight had already dictated they would. He told himself he'd take a longer route that night, that he'd pick roads where the trucks were rarer. He formed the thought carefully, as if it were an egg he might set in a bowl, and later be able to confirm he had set it there. He showered. The water came out in a thin curtain that felt like needles on his scalp. He stood longer than he needed to, hands pressed to the tile, until the mirror fogged. For a moment, he pictured clearing a circle and looking at his own face, and hearing his own voice come through something else, narrating that too. He left the mirror undisturbed. He put his boots back on and felt the familiar pinch of the left in the heel. He went to the grocery for eggs and detergent and a roll of garbage bags, paying cash from the envelope he carried in his jacket pocket without counting. At the register, the scanner beeped and the belt's rubber groaned, and he stood in the queue under lights that hummed like the warehouse, thinking about how these places made the same sounds everywhere, as if there were only one machine somewhere making them and piping them out to all the smaller rooms of the world. Nobody looked at him. They never did. It was a relief. He took his receipt and folded it end over end until it was a thin, stiff strip. He slid it into his wallet beside a row of older ones he had never thrown away, as if he might one day sit down and account for all that had been bought. On his way out, the store radio that played above the aisles slid from a country song into a brief dead patch while the system changed stations. He felt his chest clench like he had walked into sudden cold. Then the new song began, and he let out the breath he didn't know he had been holding. He laughed a little at himself, a one-syllable sound, only to stop when a thought rose up with the laugh, a memory of the calm voice saying that he would laugh and then stop. He went home with his groceries and wiped the kitchen counters as if making them clean could make the room proof. He listened to the refrigerator hum and tried to hear whether its note was the same as last night. He went to his bedroom and sat down on the edge of the bed with the envelope pulling one bill and then another to count. Not to schoolboy tally, but the older way of feeling the thickness of the stack, the give of it. He put the money back. He pressed the envelope under a weighty catalogue he had no interest in, and stood there until it was clear the envelope would not attempt to walk away. He did not turn the car radio on when he left for work in the afternoon. The sun was low, and the sky had finally produced a smear of color. The fields looked like they had been raked with a giant's fingers. He drove slowly, a little too careful at every stop, each break a little earlier than needed. The warehouse sat behind a chain-link fence with a gate that had never closed. The sign out front had missing letters, as if the building had been trying to lose its name. Inside, the same air, the same constant cold that got into your shirt and stayed behind your shoulder blades. The foreman, a spare man with a careful moustache, nodded once and looked past him at the freight log. Owen took his place on the line to break down pallets and feed the belts. They had a small crew that day, and the rhythm had to be found quickly, or else the whole operation turned shambolic with missing boxes and an angry beep that insisted something was wrong even when nothing was damaged. He worked. He liked that the body could do this on its own. His hands knew where to go, how to brace a carton with a hip while a utility blade kissed the tape, how to let the banding pop without hitting his face, how to stack so that nothing fell even when a new guy came along to lift a box from the wrong place on the wrong side. The machines sang their flat song, and his mind fell into a kind of shallow sleep that was nonetheless alert enough to keep him from cutting himself. At some point, the lights above seemed to soften and then go a shade too bright, the way fluorescents sometimes did when they thought about failing. The forklifts paused as if holding their breath, and the belt hesitated. Then everything caught itself. The intercom fizzed on, then off again, leaving them to the regular music that came from a radio someone kept near the breakroom door. It had drifted to static after the flicker. He waited, eyes low, a strip of cardboard in his hand, and listened. It cleared to an advertisement for a lumberyard, then to a weatherman describing a front that would pass with little consequence. He began to breathe again, without noticing he had stopped. He pushed the box he had partly opened down the belt and thought about how his heart had seemed to jump ahead of him, like a pet that runs up the stairs before you. Break came when the foreman clapped his hands. He liked the sound better than a horn, and they filed into the room where a coffee maker sat on a dingy counter and a row of lockers had swollen wood marred by old padlock bites. Conversations in the break room were as predictable as tide tables. A man named Carver made the same joke he always made about the coffee. A woman named Nettie unwrapped a sandwich from wax paper and set the paper down like a napkin, in a way that suggested a neatness at home. Someone else scrolled a phone and made almost sounds. Owen sat with his back to the bulletin board and let the words wash. At the far end of the room, the little radio fell silent again, and for a heartbeat pulled the conversations along with it into the quiet. Owen stared at the crumbed edge of his own sandwich and waited for that other voice. Instead, the radio rose into the start of a song he remembered from a year so far back it might as well have belonged to someone else. Nettie hummed along. Carver smacked his lips after a sip and declared the coffee good, which prompted someone to ask whether he had just now changed his mind about everything after all these years. The room's tension unspooled. On the board behind him, a new sheet of paper had been pinned with a thumbtack that had to be pushed in twice to catch. He read it after, leaning in, smelling old tape and dust behind the cork. Due to intermittent transmitter issues in the area, Some radio services may experience brief outages or signal bleed. Please be advised that company communications will continue through standard channels. Do not rely on external broadcasts for scheduling or safety alerts. It had a company letterhead and a signature that looked like a name, but could have been a sketch of a fence. He felt the thought rise in him unbidden. Of course, he wasn't the only one hearing oddness. Of course, something was wrong somewhere else, in a way that made this a little explainable. He looked around to see if anyone else had read it, whether anyone would say, "Hey, you hear anything weird last night?" Nobody looked at the board. The sheet looked fresh and ignored. The room returned to the rhythm of sandwiches. In the last hour of the shift, he went to the far freezer to pull a late order. It was loud there. Louder than the rest of the plant, the compressors stuttering in a rhythm that could be mistaken for breath. The door seals stuck unless you kicked hard. He kicked hard. He felt the freeze cut the inside of his nose, the delicate hurt of it, and then warmth in his eyes that made his cheeks feel wet even though they were dry. He moved among pallet racks like a man moving through tall trees, the lights throwing little halos on the frost-covered metal. It occurred to him there might be radios sealed in there, forgotten on a shelf behind something else, still on. Frozen in time, faint voices trapped behind plastic frost like bugs in amber. The thought arrived, and he knew it for what it was, a story his mind made to fill a quiet. He smiled at it and went on with his work. He did not look behind the boxes. He did not need to know. Outside at last, bone-tired, he stood by his car and listened for a moment to the night, as if it could argue with him. Sound was slim. A highway somewhere else. Owls in the copse near the fence. The scratch of a dry leaf under his shoe. He climbed in and sat in the dark, his hand hovering over the radio knob. He told himself to be a grown man and drive. He told himself the voice had been a mixture of chemicals in his head, the little balances of salt and sugar and electricity that made a person a person. He told himself if he wasn't careful, he would wind up the kind of man who sees meaning in receipts and finds messages in the hum of the refrigerator. He turned the radio on because not doing so felt like superstition. He turned it to a station where the DJ still spoke and said the names of old songs, and the back and forth of callers filled the car with life that wasn't his. He started to drive. He took the long way home as he had told himself he would. He cut along the ridge where the water tower watched, and then down past the feed store where the painted rooster on the sign had lost its eye to the weather and now greeted motorists with a milky blank. He went slow through a residential patch where porch lights made a path like short stars, and 3 dogs in one yard argued with the night. He didn't feel better. He didn't feel worse. He felt like a man who had to be home sooner or later and would keep moving until he was. Near the creek crossing, the radio found a patch of static on its own, as if the car had driven through a fog. He did not touch the dial. He let the white noise walk beside him. Then a voice rose under it like something standing up from under a sheet. His voice, no preamble. "He passes the mailbox with the crooked metal flag," the voice said, exactly right as he watched that mailbox bump into view on the right, then pass away in his rearview mirror like a little ship. And he sees the sign about the Farmer S market, though it does not apply to him at this hour. He notes a dead moth on the windshield and lets it stay because the effort required to remove it is out of proportion to the satisfaction he'd get from a clean arc of glass. Owen swallowed. He kept his hands where they were and tried to pull the car through time by will alone. He thinks about whether the new note on the bulletin board applies to him, the voice went on, so mild, as if it was soothing someone. He wonders how things organize themselves. He remembers a morning long ago when a man from the insurance office played a cassette tape for him, and he heard his voice as if it belonged to a stranger, and he laughed and said, "Do I really sound like that?" He promised then that he would never be surprised by his own voice again. He will break that promise repeatedly. The radio breathed. He thought it might be breathing on its own. He drove around a bend that he had always taken wide because the guardrail had a kink where somebody had not. The voice continued in the same tone that had narrated a truck's approach. It did not need him to be excited. It did not need him to believe. "He will lay awake before morning," the voice said. "He will hear the refrigerator cough once and then settle. He will notice the towel on the oven handle hanging a little crooked. He will not correct it. He will think, 'I am busy, and in no way am I busy.' He will touch the envelope in the visor and then pretend he did not." The dashboard clock, a cold-eyed dial with lines but no numbers, ticked a little forward. He told himself the station had a prankster at the console, taking calls at random and reading back an easy guess at the lives of night drivers. He told himself a lot of people drove with hands in warm air. A lot of people kept old envelopes in the visor. A lot of people thought about how their lives were laid down beside the world like small train tracks. "He will not talk about this," the voice said. "He will think about talking about it and will choose not to, and he will imagine the words he would say and how they would sound to someone who was not him. He will go to sleep and wake to a voice that is not his and that is somehow his, and he will wonder if the voice wants anything, if it is saying this because it must or because it can. He will be too tired to choose the difference." He pulled into the apartment lot with his chest tight. He turned the key and the radio died with a tiny click. He did not sit in the dark this time. He went upstairs fast, boots on this time, a dull drumming that the neighbor's dog answered with a curious little bark. He opened his door. He closed it behind him. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the small radio between the toaster and the jar and decided that if he turned that on and it spoke, he might learn which parts of his life were his. He reached out. He stopped. He took his hand back and folded it into the other behind his back like a schoolboy in a museum. He made himself wash his face. He brushed his teeth with long strokes, patient until the paste foamed too much and he had to spit. He looked at the towel. He let it hang crooked. He set his keys on the counter beside the envelope and imagined the promise sitting down beside them like a guest. He drank water from the tap, and the water tasted faintly of rubber hose and metal, the flavor of a building that had not been new for a long time. When he finally let himself lie down, he did it in dark and quiet. He could hear the street a little, and the pipes a little, and below, the neighbors moving in that careful way of people trying not to be heard. He waited for the voice, and told himself not to. He thought of the red lights on the ridge, winking in their unhelpful rhythm. He thought of the truck he did not hit and of the ditch that did not take him, and the moment the world had leaned all at once. That was the first moment he realized he was holding his breath, in case his breath in any way signaled the voice to start. He slept, or came near it, and then the refrigerator coughed. He opened his eyes. The room was the same. He could hear his own breath now, centered and slow. Then the radio on the kitchen counter, off, unlit, spoke from across the dark, like someone talking through cupped hands. There was no static first. The voice came in plain. "He will dream of numbers even though he hates them," the voice said, and in saying so rescued him from the need to speak out loud to the empty room and ask it questions, which he wanted to do. The voice did not need an answer. It continued even and exact. "He will try not to count the days, the times when the times line up. He will be good at it until he is not. He will wake and hold the object of his fear in his hands, only to find it is not there." He listened for another word and got none. Silence returned and sat on his chest like a docile weight. He slept after that, the compromised way you sleep after a rain checks the windows, in increments, the edges of each dream damp. The morning after, he stepped into a life that appeared unchanged and had in fact shifted a click on its ratchet. He went to work earlier and left earlier, a decision he made with the logic that if the world was trying to call him, he would answer on a different line. The warehouse felt already used when he arrived, the air of a room that had had too many conversations recent enough to still be remembered by the walls. On the line, Nettie dropped a box and made a small noise that was not an apology, but served. Carver wheeled a pallet jack with unusual care, as if he had made a promise to himself of his own. The intercom spoke an update about forklift safety, and then a second voice, sharp with administration, noted that all staff should read a notice about broadcast concerns. Everyone nodded in the unison of people who expected things to intrude and had chosen in advance to stay within their lanes. Owen nodded too, while a cold finger traced his spine. At lunch, he didn't sit in the breakroom. He went into the small courtyard where a single tree seemed to be losing its leaves in an orderly fashion, one that implied a schedule. The sky sat heavy. He ate an apple and counted aloud in his head the crunches back to back, then stopped counting, because it made him feel foolish and because the voice was right. He did hate numbers, and now he knew why. Counting became a net, and he did not want to be a fish. He had the thought then, intrusive and plain. Tell someone. He pictured sitting on the back steps with Carver, the two of them sharing smoke they did not need, and explaining that a radio had held his voice, that it had recited in a tidy manner the shape of his night. He pictured Carver's face doing that thing faces do when they encounter something damp and personal and not to be respected. He kept the picture. He folded it like a note he wouldn't send. He finished his apple and threw the core into the weeds and missed the weeds by a little, the core bouncing on cement and rolling to a stop by an old bottle cap. He left it there and told himself he was purposely feeding a squirrel and not being careless. Back inside, a supervisor he rarely saw paused with a clipboard near where he worked and said they might be doing some drills later in the week that would involve radio silence, and not to be alarmed if his station's monitor stopped showing updates for a short while. The note seemed rehearsed. The man's eyes did not meet his. Owen smiled, which was the same as agreeing, and as the supervisor moved along he felt a small, unreasonable anger that the word radio had been used as if it was a thing that had pieces and could be turned off like a light. He wanted to push at the word with a finger to see how solid it was. He didn't. He drove home again, and this time he did not turn the car radio on at all. He laid his right palm flat on the top of the steering wheel and let the grooves cut into his skin without moving, a discomfort he could choose, which was something. The road was bumpy where the county had performed a patch job that had settled. He recognized the bumps by memory, by the order in which they arrived, like a muttered litany. He passed the pond with the floating dock and did not look to see if anybody had put a chair out at the end the way they did in summer, when the fish, like little coins, made rings at the surface. He marked the mailbox with the crooked flag without letting his eyes stay on it. These were acts of caution, small and unnecessary, but they made a feeling of control by doing, and that was at least a feeling. At home, he set the envelope on the counter and then stacked the day's junk mail on top of it, a small choice to bury something in plain sight. He made soup from a can and listened to it warm, a soft purr that came in and out as the bubbles learned the bottom of the pan. He took a spoonful, burned his tongue, and set the spoon down and waited, and tried again. He did not turn on the radio. He did not pretend he wasn't thinking about turning on the radio. He lived around the want like people live around a small toothache, not permitting it more space than it was due. For a while the day behaved. He washed bowls and dried them with a towel that repaid attention by not leaving lint. He trimmed his nails with a small clipper that lived in a drawer with old batteries and twist ties. He stood by the window and watched a cat he had never seen before walk the line of the curb as if it were a rope. He made the bed with the same care he always used, pulling the sheet flat so the fibers sang under his palms, the sound like wind across something hard. He could have slept early, but he lay down and felt sleep refuse him. A gentle refusal at first, and then one marked by small humiliations of thought. He thought about the accident he did not have. He thought about the lurch that wasn't in the car, but in him. He thought about the voice and its detachment. He found that he could not summon anger toward it. It was too neutral to hate. It spoke as if it had no investment in the outcome, as if it would read any line handed to it. He wondered whether that was worse than if it had sounded eager. He must have drifted because he woke with the sense of having been jerked and looked at the ceiling just as the refrigerator coughed again and fell silent. The radio, dark and plastic on the counter, answered the silence with a cough of its own. It clicked, the way things click when they come awake. Then in his voice, not the voice he was used to from his head, but that altered copy, it spoke. "He will try to ignore small things," the voice said. "He will fail to ignore small things. He will line them up. He will avoid rhythms. He will develop different rhythms. He will make a story to keep from making a bigger story." Owen lay very still. He could feel his heart beat against the mattress as if the bed were a drum and somebody was rapping a finger on it. He let the voice continue, as if letting weather pass. "He will watch the porch light across the street go out," it said, and he did. The light blinked away like an eye finally giving in. "He will listen for the neighbor's dog. The dog will not bark. He will imagine a flash of light even when there is no flash. He will replay a moment under a truck's shadow like a film a friend insists he should see again. He will not call anyone. He will wonder if he should. He will decide not to. He will be patient." The room, to prove a point, was patient with him. He could hear the building settling, little stutters in the drywall like words he could not understand. He realized his mouth had gone dry. He swallowed, and the swallow sounded too loud, as if his body had done something behind his back. "He will go to the storage unit on the edge of town," the voice said, and that caught him, because he had not intended to think about that at all. He did have a unit. He kept seasonal things there, old tools, a box of roadside flares that might or might not still work, some photographs in frames turned face down to keep their glass from catching stray light. He had no business going there. He saw himself anyway. The small door, the cheap padlock, the smell of concrete in shade. The radio went on. "He will open it and find nothing unusual. He will stand there anyway and wait to feel what the room is willing to give him. He will think of leaving the radio there for a night, as if one can park a voice in a box and walk away." Sleep came in an awkward spill sometime before the hour when birds decide the world is worth remarking on. He woke sour and sallow, his mouth like someone else's mouth. He dressed and went to work without touching the envelope or the radio or the towel. He made his day inside other people's timetables, which was a relief. He counted cartons to be sure of a thing he otherwise accepted. He cut a length of banding and held one end just a second longer than required to watch it curl on the floor in a black ribbon and remember the highway at night. He did not talk about it. He did not let slip even a sliver. He wanted the thing to stay contained, in the way a paper cup holds coffee if you done a could squeeze. But that didn't stop it from finding him again, in the bagging area at the grocery on his way home, when the scanner beeped in the same soft tone it always did, and somehow made a chord with the squeal of the carter's bad wheel, a music that found his ribs and made his breath pause. Or when he turned a faucet and the first rush of water, warmer than expected, hit the bottom of the sink with a little slap that sounded like a word about to form. On the third night, he would not call it the third though he knew it was, he did as the voice had said he would. He drove to the storage unit at the edge of town, where a chain-link fence made an ugly crown along the top with its curls of wire, and a man in a golf cart made patrols too regular to be random. Owen slid the lock out and pushed the door up. The space had a smell of chalk and pathless dust. He stood in it a long time. He did not bring the kitchen radio. He told himself he had come only to confirm that the space existed exactly the way he remembered, the way some people touch a scar to be sure it has not moved. He stared at the boxes like labels might change in front of him. He lifted the lid on the one with the roadside flares and looked at them like red sticks in a field of hay, foreign and simple. He closed it. He walked to the back, where the concrete canted up a little. He touched the cinder blocks, as if heat might leak back into his finger and say what had been there. The unit said nothing. The quiet was full and unhelpful. He rolled the door back down and locked it, and listened to the lock click with a sound that made a small wave of satisfaction run down his arms like a chill in reverse. On his way out, the man in the golf cart nodded without interest and said, "Evening," and that was all the talking he did that night. The voice did not speak from the dashboard, though the radio was onto a station that played someone's late-night selections from records that sounded as if the needle had never once been asked to dance lightly. He drove slower than he had to. He watched the ditches as if they were going to produce a creature. He did not know what he would do if they did. He slept again in staggered bits. He dreamed once of the warehouse, but it had no light, and the compressors were not machines, but a throat. And when he turned to leave, the aisles had rearranged themselves into a pattern he knew to be simple and could not name. He woke with the urge to write something down, to make a list, but he refused himself that too. He had seen a man once save every receipt and then pin them to a corkboard with little labels, as if he could build a dam out of paper to hold back whatever had started in his head. He didn't want to be that man. Then, because the world does not ebb in sympathy to one man's decision, the radio in the kitchen spoke again in that measured tone. It addressed the room. It addressed him in a way that did not say his name but did not say anyone else. Which is its own kind of intimacy. "He will start to notice patterns in the small outages," the voice said. "He will notice a momentary drop in pressure in the building. Plumbing that coincides with a song ending on the station he will pretend not to listen to. He will think, if I am careful, the patterns cannot have me. He will be careful the way a man treads around a wet floor, all stiff knees and tiny steps." He laughed then because the voice had caught something funny and bleak he could not have made on purpose. He looked at the towel and straightened it 3 fingers width, then let it go crooked again by the same measure. He waited to see if the radio would note that. It did not. It did not need to catch him every time. It chose, or it was not choosing, which was worse in a new way. The following day, the company posted a larger note on the board, this one with bold letters that read, among other things, that due to regional maintenance on broadcast infrastructure, employees should expect blackouts and fluctuations, and that the company was not responsible for any personal equipment misbehavior on site. It seemed to have been written by a person who had never touched a radio and had barely touched language. It made him embarrassed, and he could not say for who. He watched people read it. Someone said, "Looks like someone messed up a tower." Someone else said, "Something's always going out." He stood with his hands in his pockets and felt the paper in the visor a mile away. He felt the note like a cover thrown over something and pressed to look flat. Later, the same day, on his way out, his car radio caught a show that appeared to be news, and then didn't. It read scores from the town ball league, as if anyone still remembered who had won all those small games. It read the weather. It read 2 lost pet announcements that sounded like names from a gravestone. Then, under a wash of static, his voice returned in a thinner version of itself, as if worn by use. "An advisory remains in effect for parts of the county," it said. "Residents may notice intermittent changes in ordinary routines. These are expected to be brief. If you see a loved one behaving out of character, consider quiet observation before intervening. Crowd together calmly. Keep the towels where they are." He recognized the structure of such advisory phrases from all the times storms had come close but not come. But there was the last line, the one that went past usefulness into teasing. He drove past the water tower and felt, for the first time, a feeling that could be named anger. He wanted to grip the knob and twist hard and shout into the speaker. What exactly did it want from him? He did none of that. He drove home and left the radio on and let the voice stop on its own while late-night advertisements came in, cheap and cheerful, as if from a world without rooms for dread. Days ran like that, and in them he became a man who lived not at the center of his day, but at a point offset and to the side, watching the way one might watch a road crew from the porch, a little distance, a little commentary. He went to work. He kept his head. He made coffee and let it cool and drank it. He measured his breath and then gave up measuring. He took the long way. He adjusted small things that would not matter to an ordinary eye, and knew they mattered to him, which is what made them matter in the end. The voice did not always speak, and when it didn't, the silence felt structured in the same way as a speech does, a prelude, a center, an ending. It missed him once, on a night when he intentionally left the radio in the kitchen on and sat in the living room in the dark, listening for it. The voice chose then to ignore him, as if he had failed to enter the right hall at the right time. He sat there with the window open a crack, the cool air kneading the curtains, and tried not to feel dismissed. One evening he drove past the old gas station where a vacancy sign had stayed lit long after the motel it belonged to had been leveled. The sign glowed on open air. He thought the word relic and then thought he didn't like it. It made memory sound tidy. The radio had been quiet all the way from the warehouse to the river, and he had not dared to change it. He squinted at the road. He tried to think of nothing. He succeeded in thinking of one thing only. What would the voice say in that calm way if it were to arrive now? It arrived then, because of course it did. He sees the light that means nothing, it said. He makes a word for it and does not like the word. He thinks about the sound of frogs in the mud, though it is not yet their hour. He drives the same drive and refuses to think of it as repetition, preferring to call it practice. He is practicing. He wanted it to say what for. The voice did not oblige. It simply marked him as a man moving through space, a measurable object, and the measuring itself made him heavier or lighter, depending on a thing he could not predict. At home, he set the envelope in a drawer because the counter had started to look like an altar. He moved it gently, not wanting to disturb a promise he had never made. He opened the refrigerator for no reason and stood in the light and decided he would not make a list, and then made a list in his head of all the times a voice had spoken and the content of its speech. He permitted himself this small accounting on the condition that he would forget it later. He forgot it later in exactly the way you forget such things. Not at all. He began to test. He did not call it that. He moved the towel by the oven handle a hair to the left and walked clear across the room and looked back at it and waited. The radio did not speak. He slid a coin under the edge of the toaster so that it sat a little off-kilter. He did not think of coins left in fields of mud. The radio said nothing. He took the receipt stack from his pocket and laid it end to end on the counter until it reached the sink, an untidy chain. The radio observed this by remaining quiet, which was its way of seeing him. It did speak about smaller things, announcing them like a calm town crier no town had ever elected. It described once the way his right eye watered a little when he cut onions, even if the onions were old and bored. It described another time the exact moment he decided not to open a message he knew would contain an invitation he did not know how to refuse. It told him in that unbraided tone that he would sleep later than intended, that he would wake beneath a sound like chalk on stone, which would turn out to be a radio advertisement bleating from a neighbor's kitchen. It spoke not of fate, but of itinerary. Through all of this, The truck from the first night haunted the horizon of his mind, as if it were always about to come over the hill. He did not go back to the gravel pit road for a while. He made himself a map. You could not draw routes that did not exist on paper. And he followed them with the conviction of a man who has convinced himself New Year's are different if you step across their threshold on the left foot first. When at last necessity trimmed his options, construction on the ridge, a water main issue on the lower route, an advisory about a downed pole, he took the curve near the gravel pit again in the late hour with his mouth dry and both hands on the wheel. No truck waited. No prophecy came. The voice waited perhaps for him to belong to it again. He drove on, feeling both vindicated and teased. When the voice finally shifted its posture, he felt it physically, a change in the bench under him. He had just eaten. He had just rinsed his bowl and tilted it in the drying rack so that droplets ran one way instead of another. He had just lined up the bottle of dish soap with its label pointing toward the room, a habit he had not noticed, becoming a habit. The radio, which was off, said into the room, "The next part begins now." He walked from the sink to the counter on his heels, because that's what you do when you want to know if the floor sounds the way you expect it to sound, and he set his hands on either side of the radio as if warming them. He did not touch the dial. He did not breathe loudly. He did not, in any way, give it permission to make a ceremony of him. "He will think," the voice said, "that describing is harmless. He will begin to wonder who is doing the writing. He will think of a man at a desk with a pad and a pencil and a cup he never washes, a little ring of brown at the waterline. He will wonder what the man wants. He will ask in his head if the man is him. He will reject that, then entertain it, then make a joke of it to himself because jokes are comforting. He will laugh once. He will hear himself. He did laugh once. He despised how well catalogued he was. He waited for the voice to continue, and it did. But now it did so with a tide in it, something approaching a current. Until then, the voice had been an observer scrupulously without preference. Now it brought him a thing that looked like choice. "He will go back to the car," it said. "He will turn the radio there on. If he does, he will hear a report. He will decide whether to keep driving, to turn left or right, to go forward into a thing he understands might already be written. If he does not, he will hear nothing, and he will understand nothing. He will choose what to live with." He stood in the kitchen with a damp dish towel in his hand and his keys heavy in his pocket. The building was quiet, except for the old man down the hall who left his television on to argue with at low volume. He could see, side by side, the versions of himself the voice meant. The man who remained, who put the towel back on its hook and sat on the couch and let the refrigerator hum him to sleep. And the man who went down the stairs and put himself behind a wheel and went to fetch a thing that might tell him a future he could use or not. He tried to summon anger to push him one way or the other. He managed only a kind of stubbornness, which is different and less efficient. He went anyway. He locked the door as if that did anything. He walked the stairs and did not keep the boots quiet. The night outside was the thick kind you felt on your teeth. His car waited with its mouth closed. Inside, the dashboard lighted the same soft, dull orange, as if nothing had changed in the world. Owen took a breath and turned the radio on. It gave him static, then a bleached-out oldies track, then static again, and he let it travel across until, like a swimmer surfacing, that voice found a pocket of air. In local news, it said in his timbre, his cadence, his absence of drama, a sedan at this very hour moves south on the long road, a man within careful at his work. He is part of a pattern he resists naming. He is asked to make a turn. He will weigh the turn, then make it. The sky remains closed. The road remains as it ever was until it is not. He put the car in gear. He picked the road that led toward the ridge because the ridge had always been there, because the lights there pulsed in a way you could measure against your heart. He drove with a frail kind of certainty. the kind you have when you don to trust the map and are therefore very sure you will arrive. As he passed the spot where, nights before, the truck had pushed the air into the car and set the world to swaying, the radio cleared its throat and then announced, not cruelly, "At the crest, he will see an obstruction. He will have time to stop. He will stop. He will not hit anything. He will understand then what has been asked of him. He will continue to pretend he does not." The crest came with the lights winking steady. There was indeed a line of orange barrels blocking part of the lane, a trench cut, and covered where the county had lifted a section of the road to get at some pipe or line. He braked calmly. He went around the barrels into the opposite lane with no oncoming traffic, a law-abiding man behaving outside the line to stay within it. He felt a little lightness when the car returned to cleared pavement, not unlike gratitude. He did not let the voice have that. He kept his mouth straight. He continued to drive because stopping after that would have turned the thing into a game. The radio said nothing. The world orchestrated no additional counsel. He reached an intersection where one traffic signal worked and the other blinked, and he waited a respectful amount of time and then went because that is what you do at a blinking signal. You go and you hope. He found himself at the highway. He rarely used a thin stripe of noise like a river that kept to its channel most days, and he turned his wheels along its edge, all the while keeping his eye fixed on the place where the wind turbines lived like giants who never reached down. He thought then that if the voice was trying to shepherd him, it had a funny way of showing it. It did not argue, it did not plead, it distorted nothing. It simply named the small bones of a night and asked him to provide the meat. That kind of quiet felt like a trap, because it allowed him dignity until it didn't. By the time he reached the pull-off with the single stump where teenagers had carved initials he never could read, he had made up a story for the voice to be. A kind of mirror turned outward, a social club for a single. He parked and turned the radio off and sat with the windows down and listened to things too small to matter. In the grass there were little men, he told himself, with audiometers and clipboards recording the friction of his sleeve against the seat. He sat until the night changed shape around him, as hours do to a sitting man. Then, because something in him had to perform fidelity to a plan once made, he steered home, and before going in, turned the radio in the kitchen to static and stood in the middle of the room like a subject for a painter who had not arrived. The voice did not speak. The refrigerator hummed. He put his hand on the counter, palms flat. He waited. He let the waiting be an answer to a question he could not hear. He slept somehow after that, the puddle of it shallow enough for light to reach the bottom. He dreamed not of trucks or of roads or of men with clipboards, but of towels hung in a line across a yard and the weight of water pulling them into long, sad faces. He woke with the notion that the voice had been a weather report for a storm that might not come. He felt relieved and then ashamed for feeling anything about it. When he rose, the room was what it was. His breath moved. The radio kept its peace. He looked at the envelope in the drawer and left it where it lay. He dressed and left the apartment, and in the stairwell heard a sound of tearing metal. It was small and real. The community mailbox door had swung and bit a hinge and made that small surrendering noise that thin things make. He looked up out of reflex to make sure the ceiling was not about to come down. It stayed. He let himself smile in a way that did not reach his eyes. On his way to the car, he caught a reflection of himself in the window of the empty unit across the way. A blurred man with a bag and a habit of looking over his shoulder. He took a step to the right to break the reflection, a small private ritual he had made that said, "You are not only a thing observed." A kid on a bike rolled by with a radio on the handlebars, bleating an old song, and the spokes made a clicking noise when the card stuck in them hit just so. The kid did not look at him. The radio did not change its voice. the world failed to tell him anything. He got in the car and placed his hands where they always went and did the act of turning a key like a person in a simple story. The engine answered. The radio stayed off. He breathed. He chose his road, and it seemed for the span of a few motions that the next part might be done with him, that the voice had decided it had done its portion of work and would hand him back his edges and say, "Take care now." The light ahead changed, and he stopped and waited at a red circle that did not feel like permission denied, but like a reasonable request. When the light changed back and he moved forward, the radio woke itself. Not on, not lighted. The voice came through its coolest wires in his plain voice and left on the air, weightless, a sentence that might count for a beginning or an end. It said, with the same newsroom calm it had favored since the first night, "Now he will hear what he is afraid of hearing." He did not touch the dial. He did not touch his face to make sure it was still arranged the way it always had been. He did not pray. He drove, and the road rose toward him as it always did, and on both sides ditches held a darkness that waited as politely as a guest on a porch, and the wind turbines winked the slow, solemn yes of machines that have learned patience. He breathed one breath after another until breaths made their own rhythm and told him nothing. The voice continued after a waiting that had the weight of a test. It spoke what it chose to speak, and it spoke not of trucks or of barrels or of envelopes. It spoke his last breath, quiet as a curtain going down, and he felt what a man feels when he is told in a calm voice something he had already believed might be true, a kind of relief so bleak it could be mistaken for courage. He had to make a turn. He made it. He did not know what part that was. He drove into the long quiet between now and then. The voice, which had told him so much and so little, fell into a silence that sounded to him exactly like wind. In the days that followed, the town behaved like a person who has received an uncertain diagnosis and chooses to act as if nothing has changed. Brookfell's stoplights blinked when they were meant to shine steady. The little station at the edge of town sold coffee that tasted faintly of burnt dust, and said so on a sign as if owning it were a virtue. The wind along the ridge lay down flat, and every now and then a sheet of it rose up and moved leaves across asphalt in a tidy hiss. People went about what they called their business. They nodded at one another and said the usual things. Behind those gestures there was a reluctance to name, a hush that acted like fabric over furniture in a house long closed. Owen made his breakfasts and washed his cups and changed his socks and went to work and came back and did it again. He told himself the voice, if it wanted to, could sit outside these facts like weather on the wrong side of a window. He told himself that refusal might count for something. He made a point of not reading the bulletin board in the breakroom until after he had eaten, as if that order mattered. The board grew busier. One day it offered a notice about scheduled transmitter maintenance, then another about a test of the emergency tone that would not be an emergency, and then a third that was vaguer and wore the heavy name of a regional office. That one asked citizens to refrain from speculative listening during known periods of bleed. The phrase speculative listening made him smile because it gave shape to something he had been doing alone and made it seem like a hobby. People read these notices and said the words out loud, with their mouths cocked toward humor, as if the humor might shield the soft part under the ribs. Carver read an entire paragraph and said, "Look at that, without decoration." Nettie folded the page S-edge into a neat dog ear as if she meant to return to it later, and never would. The foreman took a pen and underlined a phrase about safety. No one said anything about voices. Or perhaps they did, and Owen didn't to hear because he had started to move through rooms as if he were a piece of furniture in them rather than a person, which meant there were conversations he stood beside and did not enter, and maybe in those conversations Other people said the thing he could not. At the warehouse, the machines performed with a determined air, like beasts convinced by habit to come forward when called. There were days when the belt made a thin squeal for an hour, and then stopped, and everyone accepted it as one accepts an insect in the kitchen that will not be removed until there is an obvious reason. The intercom delivered messages in a clipped voice that was no one's, and once, during the afternoon, it crackled and offered a line of static that had a shape to it, a kind of holding pattern, and Owen held himself still and waited to see if his voice would pour down upon them from above. It did not. Someone rapped the casing with knuckles, and the intercom behaved again. He kept to his quiet. He started to notice small outages in the world he had previously let slide past him. The soda machine in the breakroom took his bill and thought about it, and then returned it with a heartfelt sigh. The streetlights on his way home glowed with a kind of lateness, as if electricity passed through them with less certainty than it had before. The refrigerator at home hiccuped, not only when it cycled, but when he stood near it to listen, which made him feel observed and petty in the same breath. He performed ordinary routines with slightly altered hands. Once on his way back from the grocery, where the scanner beeped with a patience that made him feel scolded, he stopped at the small park by the river to sit on a bench that had been dedicated to a person he had never met and would never know. The river moved thinly, marking little stones and the bones of branches that had decided river life did not suit. He sat and listened to absence, and then to presence as a radio in a passing truck, sketched a bridge of sound into his air, and then took it away. He watched a woman across the water walk a dog with a face like a mop. He wondered if her radio had spoken to her in her voice. He spun out a private wish that perhaps this oddness had chosen only him for reasons both humiliating and grand. He sat with the wish, and then let it go because it felt like asking to be singled out. That evening, his kitchen radio found him again without being asked. He had not touched it. He had come home, boiled pasta, turned the stove off with that sneaking gratitude you feel after fire obeys you, and gone to dry his hands when it spoke. The town affords him the dignity of a pause, the voice said, and for a blink he believed the town had granted this and not some larger, unnameable thing. He practices nothing new. He wishes to. He resists speculation. He counts what he can count and finds the numbers impatient. He looks at a bench by the river and tries to guess the weight of a life by the thickness of its plate. He leaned on the counter and listened. The voice ran on. He will hear other people's days bleed through, it said, as if to move him forward. He will stand at the sink and listen to a weather report that misnames a town he has never seen. He will be told in a plain tone about power lines he cannot picture. He will hear a man in a far city ask his wife where she put the thing with the batteries, and she will answer, not on the air, but somehow on it. Owen stayed where he was because moving would make the moment more real. In the days that followed, the voice kept its promise. Other rooms crashed softly into his. In the car one night he heard a voice like a version of his asking someone to bring in the wash. Because storm clouds were making a case in the west, and it would be a shame to have clean shirts take on the smell of wet dust. In the grocery line, he heard a soft explanation of a chess move, as if a father were saying to a child, "No, the knight hops, watch." He thought these moments might comfort him, proof that a larger world overlapped his quiet one in ways that did not target him. They comforted him until they did not. Randomness, stretched over too many days, begins to fit like a shirt in a way that makes you suspect tailoring. On one such evening he sat in his apartment, reading the label on a jar that had always been in his pantry, as if it were a message in code. He had the radio off. He had earned that. He chewed a mouthful of bread and let the dry heaviness of it keep him in the room. Then the intercom in the hallway clicked. He had never heard it speak in the time he had lived there. He believed it only existed to keep a door lock from becoming decorative. It clicked again, a little softer, and a voice came out that was practical and unbothered, and told residents there would be a brief water interruption at dawn to address a pressure issue. It thanked them for their patience. The intercom released its grip on the air. Owen found himself glad to have been told a thing that did not hint at prophecy. He kept that gladness like a hot coin in his pocket. The interruption arrived when said. He held his hand under the tap and felt the line grind to a stop, and then cough once in a bored way, and then give nothing. He considered standing there for the length of the whole interruption, like someone keeping vigil. He moved on, only to hear the radio in the kitchen, still not on, offer a line of advance notice he did not need. He will see the dry faucet and will imagine the inside of it like a throat-holding breath. He will say nothing. He said nothing. He continued to say nothing in a steady profession of silence that began to feel like its own superstition. He became the man who did not tell a story, not because he had nothing to say, but because he believed the not saying held the door closed. He did not tell Carver at the pallets when Carver stood with his hands on his hips and said, "You ever get the feeling the radio's too friendly lately?" He did not tell Nettie when she came in with her lunch, and set it down and said, "I keep hearing 2 different stations and neither one has the music I like." He gave them half smiles, which is what people give one another when there's a shared joke none of them want to untangle. Soon, small institutional constraint bled into the shape of his days. The warehouse announced a policy about personal devices and instructed workers to keep them off during certain hours of the evening, a measure that was implied to be about safety and efficiency. The town sent a mailer about a community advisory hour during which residents were encouraged to refrain from operating radios, televisions, public address systems, or other transmitters in the interest of signal integrity. The word encouraged did a lot of work in those sentences. He read the mailer at his kitchen table and admired its diagrams, small drawings of antennas with polite X marks over them, as if the antennas might be embarrassed into compliance. He obeyed where obeying did not cost him anything. He turned the car radio off during the stated hour and let the engine be the only sound. The engine did not mind. In his apartment, he sat and listened to the building itself. He let the language of pipes and vents take over and tried to imagine that he lived inside a machine made to make him a placid animal. But the voice found its way into hours before and after and around whatever anybody suggested. It was good at that. It did not sound irritated by their rules. It observed them as a person watches a bird on a windowsill, not unkindly, not engaged. He told himself in private that if an ending was required, he would prefer a stingy one, a neat cut, rather than an atmosphere that went on forever. He said it not out loud, but inside his head, in a voice he chose not to examine. He said it once, then returned to washing his plate and setting it upright in the rack at an angle he had learned drained best. The very next night, driving home under a sky that behaved like a lid pulled down to keep something in, he allowed himself to turn the radio on for a stretch of road that ran straight enough to pretend to be safe. He told the radio, somewhere between thought and breath, that he would give it that much. It answered at once, as if it had been leaning in and waiting for permission to take shape. "Reports of reflected speech continue," the voice said. "Advisories remain in place. Residents are reminded that roads near the gravel pits are limited to local traffic due to equipment staged there." It said this in the tone a person uses for an inventory of canned goods. Then, without changing, it folded into his smaller life, the way a man in a booth folds a bigger map down to the county he needs. He goes on anyway. He says, "I am local." He does not say it out loud. He puts his hand flat on the wheel. He pretends his breath is not counting itself. He took the longer route again, detouring past the boarded feed store where someone had written a short sentence, on the plywood, that made no sense to him, and that a crew had only halfway painted over, leaving the sentence with a ghostly second life. He slipped behind a school whose playground equipment looked like an arrangement of spare parts awaiting assembly. He went through a neighborhood where porch lights came on like blossoms and went off like decisions. He felt, for a handful of minutes, like a man who could lay down his own track where he went and force the world to follow along. A row of barricades stopped him. They had been moved into his road with the gentle authority of things borrowed from a county garage. A sign said something simple about closure for work and asked for patience. He turned the wheel the other way. He found himself back on the ridge road without meaning to be. He thought about how small a place can be when you reach the edges too quickly. A pair of trucks went by, not the long haulers but dump trucks, their beds open to a dark that swallowed what they carried. He let both pass and then started again, measuring the road as if it were an argument he could win by recitation. The voice returned with a kind of composed appetite that told him it had been practicing on its own in his absence. "Here he is," it said, not pleased, simply taking attendance. He goes the way he avoided. He tells himself the advisory is for other people. He thinks of the first night and its narrow miss. He rehearses the way his hands feel on the wheel. He does not like that his body remembers. He keeps his car at a pace that allows later to become never. He did not accelerate. He did not decelerate. He did not glance into the mirror yet because he believed glancing would make the moment choose its shape, would put a magnet to filings and collapse the random into the configured. He held his face upright and his jaw gentled, and he waited for a space to open in the night. On the road's right shoulder, a fox darted, changed its mind, and vanished like a decision removed from a notebook. He let breath go. He let the slight relief of encountering a small life wash a little of the ache from his arms. He reached his apartment without incident, which felt like a favor he was not sure he had earned. He straightened the towel without thinking, and then deliberately left it crooked, a gesture that now felt like a conversation he was having with no one. He lay down and did not sleep for a while. And when sleep came, it did not bring images of trucks or radios, but a long hallway, with doors that stayed shut, no matter how steadily he walked toward them. Morning, when it came, began with a notice slipped under his door, in a tidy envelope that reminded him of the office in town where people stood quietly beside the water machine to avoid their turn at a window. The envelope contained a letter from the management of the building addressing the ongoing advisory. It asked residents to refrain from the use of personal receivers during an evening window and to report any instances of interference that might indicate building wiring issues. It offered, in small print, the suggestion to practice quiet reflection during the window. He liked the phrasing even as it pricked him. He put the letter with the unpaid bills and told himself he would tape it to the refrigerator, and then did not. At work the same day, a small oddness. On the line beside his radio, someone kept tuned to a station that always played the same 5 songs in a loop, all of which he knew and none of which he could name. Fell silent during a track, and then offered a voice that was neither his nor anyone's he recognized. It was a woman speaking in a low reportorial tone, reciting with what sounded like love a list of lost items: a ring, a child's jacket, a cat, a set of keys, a husband. Owen looked up and saw Nettie glance at him, and then away. The foreman walked over and turned the volume knob down to spare himself the choice of whether to turn it off. They went back to work. Owen considered that the voice might have spoken a thing intended for someone across town and landed here by mistake, like an errant letter in a cluster of mailboxes that a neighbor kindly returns. There was talk of a meeting. The supervisor, whose clipboard had looked like a shield, appeared and told them there would be a brief assembly in the loading bay after lunch to discuss policy shifts. The workers nodded and did that pause everyone does when a day S shape is changed by a phrase like assembly. After lunch, they stood in their coats and watched breath make dragon smoke while the supervisor read from a paper about schedules and safety and, tucked inside these things, listening etiquette. The etiquette sounded like church reminders for children, and it made Owen's chest tighten in an odd way because etiquette implied a choice, and he was no longer convinced he was choosing. He stayed late that night because staying late felt like a decision with a spine under it. He'd broken down a last pallet under the wrong light, the one that hummed and never settled on its brightness, and he let his blades slide through tape while the belt rattled its dissatisfaction in small bursts. When he finally drove out of the lot, the town looked like a map he had seen too often and had nonetheless memorized. He turned left out of habit, and then right out of stubbornness, and then right again because the first right made the second necessary. He found himself angled toward the gravel pit road again and told himself it was not a circle. It only felt like one. There was fog that night. It did not come all at once. It began at the low edges like a creep, like the suggestion of remembrance. And then, in the middle distance, it gathered, a whitish fondness that blurred the edges of signs. He put the heater on his hands and felt dishonest about it, as if he were trying to be too comfortable in the face of something that required a different posture. He turned the radio on with an impatience that surprised him. He needed a sound that would not be the voice and could stand in for a person. Static answered, generous and blank. He left it there. He let the white sound carry him through the town's last houses. He passed the convenience store that sold everything and nothing. He passed a church that had taken half its letters down to repaint them and had stopped midway, leaving it calling itself something too simple. He passed the turn toward the storage units without looking. He reached the water tower and raised his chin the way you do when a tower is near. Only then did the voice come, as if to prove that refusal was not a binding contract. "The fog helps him," it said. "It allows him to think his edges are softer than they are. He sees the world newly kind. He knows better. He continues anyway. He approaches the familiar hazard." Owen did not want to know which hazard the voice meant. He would not name the truck. He would not name the ditch. He would not make a story of barrels and closures. He told himself hazard could mean anything. He told himself in the next breath that this was both true and cowardly. The voice continued as though none of his counter-thoughts had weight. "He approaches the curve, near the pits," it said. "He will see no truck yet. He will see, perhaps, a flicker in the fog like a lamp prodding its way through rice paper. He will keep his lane. He will measure his breath. He will choose to believe he has been given a rehearsal and not a script." He kept his lane. He measured nothing but pretended not to measure anything. The road ahead held a dimness that made him present in a way he had not been for days. The act of driving became a narrow dialect he could speak without vocabulary, a mouthful of simple sounds. Turn, hold, move, stay. He felt the vague life of other vehicles somewhere else in the fog. He heard a truck cry out on a parallel road, a long mechanical lowing and a hiss that suggested a downshift. He did not yet see any lights behind him. He turned the dial one notch, a muscle memory without intention. Static deepened, as if the fog had a voice of its own. Then a new tone swam up through it, a frequency his body recognized in the way you recognize a song you do not like. A faraway newscaster read a line about a minor incident near one of the quarries, a vehicle off the road and no injuries reported, followed by a brief advisory about visibility. The voice that read it did not carry his grain. It carried the region's casual neutrality, like a clerk confirming a credit. He let some air out of his chest. He thought, maybe this will be one of those nights when it says nothing. He said the thought, and then watched it dissolve in his rear view as a pair of small white lights appeared in the fog and became not small. They were far. They were not far for long. They drew a line in the mist that told him exactly how fast a thing can approach when it wishes to. He kept his lane. He tightened his hands in a way the wheel could feel. He left his foot where it was. The voice in the radio, when it returned, did not hurry. It never had. He will learn that anticipation is its own kind of injury, it said. He will keep himself neat on the lane as if neatness were kindness. He will think of past nights like pockets of other weather. He will hear what he thought was not for him returned to him multiplied. He did not want multiplication. He wanted subtraction. He wanted the lights behind him to subtract themselves from his mirror and go in search of another man who had made different promises. The lights did not owe him that. They grew in the mirror and then grew again. He told himself that trailers drift and drivers adjust, and roads have shoulders, and ditches are built at an angle to hold what falls. He told himself that luck is a word people use when they mean the absence of an obvious enemy. The truck came closer. He could hear it now as more than sound. He could feel its will. He kept his car true, not out of heroism, but because deviation felt like kneeling. The white in his mirror became a face, and the face became a wall, washing the road in pallor, and his hands learned again that leather can give you back a little of your own grip if you ask it. The voice summarized this in the way it summarized everything, precise and oddly tender, like a nurse confirming a chart. He is inside the part of the night he feared, it said. He recognizes it not because it looks like memory, but because it feels like a place he arranged and then forgot. He hears himself narrated and wishes it were someone else. He is not granted that. There are moments when time performs an act of petty cruelty and takes on elasticity. He felt that elasticity. Street signs withdrew and then pushed forward. The air between his car and the world thinned. The truck's lights drew a box around him, and he, inside that box, kept breathing with a stubbornness that embarrassed him. The trailer wavered, only a hair. He was ready, because the body is a machine that hoards its best lessons. He corrected without a flourish. The car complained and then made peace. The truck settled back into a line that made sense to anybody watching. He could have pretended to himself in that instant that the night had returned to ordinary business. He could have believed that the voice had brought him to a threshold, only to teach him that thresholds exist precisely to be crossed without incident. He believed this for long enough to become angry when the voice said gently, "Now." He did not have any prayer. He had the word now ringing in his head like a dropped coin turning circles on wood, diminishing in a way you can graph if you're inclined. He did not look at the radio to confirm it had spoken. He did not look anywhere but forward. The road persuaded him to stay in it. He stayed. In his mirror, a second set of lights appeared behind the first, smaller and higher. And then within the first pair, a brightening as if a third eye had opened. He understood in that second that there were two trucks layered in the fog, a lead and a follower, the second a small distance that is large at speed, and that whatever had been rehearsal had ended. The first truck made its pass the way a larger creature avoids crushing a smaller, only to make a path for the next to do what the first, in politeness, did not. The second came along with a kind of impatience. The second's trailer cut a line in the mist that felt personal. It drew across his back quarter with a gentleness he would have praised under other circumstances. He felt the push of air change to the pull of wake in a handful of heartbeats. He held his car steady and thought, "This is not inevitable." He repeated the thought with a conviction he did not quite possess. The voice spoke all the while in the only way it knew how. "He hears it," it said. "He feels the little pull. He stays neat. He chooses his place. He believes choice is a shape that does not break. He sees the road's edge open like a mouth and decides he will not be eaten. He is brave in a way that looks like staying put. He might have stayed alive in that way. Many people stay alive. By accident, by divine disinterest, by the margin in which a large thing misses a small thing, by the nervous mercy of a human hand correcting in time. He felt that margin present, a narrow bridge drawn in air. He put his car upon it. In the moment, his front tire met the raw edge of a patch where the county had not yet smoothed what it dug. The car hit a shudder that threw the neatness out of his hands. The wheel tugged to the right with a personality it usually lacked. He corrected again, smaller, and the correction became an argument with itself. The second truck's tail caught the air and flapped it like a rug. He could feel, in that tiny pocket, both choices: to be proud and to be saved, to drift and recover, to hold and be held. The voice did not say stay or go. It kept its job of recitation. He remembers, it said, that he is human. He remembers the feel of a dull blade, a hair too long. He remembers a small cut he made to his hand that he did not feel until he saw it. He remembers a towel hanging crooked. He remembers the exact temperature of his kitchen after the refrigerator coughs. He remembers he is not the only man in a car. He forgets the rule about not looking back. He looks. He looked. Of course he did. The second truck's face was full and plain in the glass. It forgave nothing because forgiveness was not its business. The road turned slightly of its own accord, the way roads do to keep drivers honest. The ditch in the curve had been dug deeper over the summer to address runoff. He had noted this weeks ago without thinking, and now thought of the men who had done it, their cigarettes in their mouths, how one had scraped at the inside of his boot with his other boot, while he waited for the backhoe to finish. He considered, in the strangest calm, that this thing was not about him any more than the frost inside the freezer at the warehouse was about the boxes he put there. The radio had time for one more line, and it used it to be kind. He will understand, it said, that nothing meant him harm, and that this is somehow worse. The edge arrived. The tire slid into it as into a groove carved for that purpose. The steering wheel went loose for a blink and then tried to leap. He made the kind of sound men make when they do not want to call it fear. Light came through the cabin, as if someone had opened all the doors at once. He felt a sideways lurch that belonged to physics, not malice. Metal complained in a voice that had never before spoken to him. There was a smell like heated wire and a taste like blood in the mouth, but without any of the facts of blood. He kept breathing because the body insists. He had a thought so quick and bright it seemed to be thrown rather than created. Move. And he moved what he could, which was not much. He made a simple correction, a small translation in space, and for a heartbeat it felt like choosing. Then the choice was taken from him. He did not hear the strike the way he thought he would. The world became briefly occupied by a high note, thin and silver. It came from everywhere. He imagined the note was the thing that kept the truck from flattening him, the thing that lifted him out of the way and placed him elsewhere. Then the note became quiet, not because it ceased, but because his ears decided discretion. The seatbelt dug, which meant it worked. The windshield did not shatter. It folded into a pattern and then held the pattern. His teeth met in a way they hadn't since childhood. He thought of the bench by the river and the weight of the plate and how the river had chosen that day to move modestly, and he had admired this. He thought of the envelope still in the drawer like a little flat animal hibernating. He thought of the towel, hung crooked, a flag flown at a height nobody had ordered. He wanted to fix the towel and found it funny. He found it funnier that the voice knew where his mind had gone and said, in the soft neutrality he had come to hate, "He thinks about a towel." Time returned to a gait that could be understood. He felt someone else's lights travel past the shape of him. He watched the fog take a breath and put itself back on like a shawl. He felt the car stop, intending to move further. In the mirror, there was a delicacy of light as the truck ahead of him. He had not gone under it, he realized. He had not, slowed and pulled to the side and became a geography. He did not count anything. He told himself he was permitted to count and chose not to. The voice had grown quiet. He thought with an absurd flash of pride that he had reached a place it had not yet mapped. Then the radio cleared another throat somewhere, and his voice came through one last time, cleaner than before, as if the fog had washed it. It described, as if to a third party, the deceleration of a car, the lonely call of a long horn diminishing, the way the night takes back what was briefly bright. It said, "A man breathes." It said, "This breath, and this breath, and this one." It said the very next breath would be his last. He did not argue. He did not have the materials with which to build an argument, even if he had wished to. He made the breath that counted for him. He listened. The breath sounded like the refrigerator's small cough at home, like a faucet that had been turned just shy of on, like cardboard sliding on a belt, like wind passing the mouth of a bottle, like tires across a patch of road repaired with a frugal hand. He made the next breath. It arrived and left without ceremony. He made the last the voice had given him. It was not remarkable. It was workmanlike. It did not have a color or a claim. It left him the way kids leave a room without closing the door, assuming the hallway knows to take care of itself. The radio said nothing further because there was nothing further to say. The engine clicked as it cooled. Distant, a late siren tried on the night. The fog accepted all of it with its usual appetite. He felt the part of him that had always listened turn a knob to lower the volume on the world. He understood in that second that the voice had never wanted anything from him, and that wanting had been his business only. He felt a narrow sadness on behalf of all the small things he had put in order on counters and under towels. He waited to be frightened and was not. Outside the car, the truck grounded its weight, and a man inside it spoke on a radio that behaved like all radios in the end. It carried a voice from one place to another without a clear idea of what it was transporting. The man's words fizzed and dissolved and resolved into the universal sound of asking for help. The wind pretended it had somewhere to go. In a building miles away, a refrigerator coughed and quieted. A towel on an oven door leaned a fraction toward the floor. He did not hear any of that. He had already given himself to the silence he had been practicing for. It took him as a matter of course, the way a drawer takes a letter, the way a ditch takes water, the way a voice takes a sentence and makes it whole, and then lets it go.